Okay, let's finish up on the Europe slides. When you're looking at Europe, it's something you're going to see all semester long. Marshall mentions it a lot, is the fact that people live in history. Despite the fact that, especially in the United States, we're very bad at it, everyone else in the world is actually really good at it. They very much identify who they are in the here and now with what their collective and individual perception is of what they were in the past. So if you're talking about the folks that call themselves British, they're not only talking about who they are in 2022, they're also talking about everything from, Charles I to King Arthur to, God knows what. And all that makes up who they are. So people live in history. And, there's nothing wrong with that. That is what it is. But where it gets really scary in the case of Europe, as in a lot of other areas, is they then judge others based on history. So the British attitude towards the French isn't based on the French in 2022 as if they're meeting for the first time. It's based on the thousands of years of interaction or lack of interaction or warfare between the two. The British and the French, and bring the two together, and immediately what pops into both everyone's mind is the Napoleonic Wars, among other things, or say World War I or World War II, both of which ended a while ago. So in that context, it's important to remember that in Europe, for almost all Europeans, along with most other groups, now is sort of the tip of the iceberg that's based in the past. It's not a standalone thing. And when you combine this, what I mentioned last time, with the idea of ethnic nation state logic, which is the fact that if you're German, for example, your sense of being German is tied to a very strong sense of sociobiology. You see that in that video you guys hopefully have watched. The fact that Germans inherit their Germanness is to be the stereotype. And therefore, in that context, one is that Germanness is responsible for who Germans are, who Germans were, but also is responsible for the relationships of folks around them. So if you're looking at 2022 in the EU, huge part of the stress factors in the EU have to do with this idea of one of ethnic identity tied to nation state, Germany, France, Spain, etc. But also the relationships that they've stereotyped of each other's that are based not on just now, but are also based in the past. The German stereotypes of the French, for example, are based on what they see as having conquered France in World War II and then, making a good shot at it in World War I. And then, of course, beat the French in 1870. I mean, the list goes on and on. So their view of the French is mitigated, if you would, by the French failure to win over Germany unless they got buddies. The French attitude towards the Spanish is based on the collective historical relationships of those two areas. So everyone in Europe sees each other as sort of a contemporary manifestation of past history. Now, when you combine that to idea of ethnicity tied to sociobiology, or if you would, inherited ethnicity versus ethnicity by virtue of learning a culture or something like that, that in that context, that leads you to a lot of the tensions. And that sort of segues into the 21st century and the EU. As I mentioned last time, when you look at the EU, you have to remember the EU is a very complex phenomena. It originally develops as a response. So it's a reactive phenomenon to the fact that post-World War II, the destruction of most of Europe and the destruction of most of Europe's production capacity, also just the fact that you've killed off most of your young men. So you've just lost a large part of your population, especially the productive age. So in that context, they're just not competitive post-World War II. So collectively getting together as a group becomes sort of a mutual assured survival in competition with the United States or, Japan/China, whoever. And so it's not that they get together because they really want to be buddies and they want to be a collective. They get together because they don't really see they have any choice. So everyone sort of backs into this. Now, the other thing that then happens then is because they're sort of backing into it, they're very careful and very aggressive to make sure they keep their national identities. So the Belgians don't become any less Belgian because they're in the EU. The Dutch don't become any less Dutch because they're in the EU. Germans sure as hell don't become any less, German because they're in the EU. So they sort of collectively have this, but they're still independent countries, and they're very strong, almost all of them, very, very strongly tied to national, sort of nation state, sociobiology-based and inherited ethnic identity. So it makes for a very complex scenario. Now, by the early 2000s, let me switch here. Okay, by the early 2000s, with basically this chunk of Europe being in the EU, two things happen. The EU works. The folks in the EU are doing better than they were before. You have free trade and travel throughout the regions I mentioned before. So what you get is the folks in the eastern part that originally aren't part of the EU want in because they can see the enormous trade benefits. And in a rather cynical way, especially your eastern countries, most specifically Germany, come to the conclusion that letting these countries in has the great advantage. One, it's going to open up more markets to sell German, say French products. But secondly, it's also going to provide cheap labor. So if you're Volkswagen, for example, or I don't know, some other big company, you can open up factories in, say, Slovakia or someplace like that because the labor is a lot cheaper than Germany. Because you have to remember one of the things about the EU is there's no, standardized, for example, minimum wage. While they have a lot of things they agree on, how much you pay people and the working conditions really aren't, a unified thing. So if you're Germany with very high paid workforce and you're a German company, the idea of having German factories in this sort of poorer new part of the EU and the eastern part is really attractive because that keeps you, market competitive. And since the EU originally was designed as a market thing, it was designed as a production, capitalist organization that actually works, and that's the way they see it. Now, for the other countries, what happens over time is the more and more this becomes a collective thing. And as I mentioned last time, sort of in passing, one of the huge things that occurs in the 90s when the EU really forms and starts sort of organizing itself is the countries in the southern part, which of course really haven't accessed this production base. Because you have to remember that this whole river network, the whole, highly efficient, very cheap way of moving stuff around is north of the Alps here, and it's north of the Pyrenees here. So it's basically in this section here. So the countries, from France on up over, through over to Poland, basically all have access to good river systems, good networks, cheap transportation, et cetera, and a fair amount of resources. If you're the Alps and south, especially Italy, Greece, Serbia, stuff like that, you're out of luck. So the northern part of the EU does much better out of the EU than the southern part. So the southern part of the EU very quickly gets into two things. One, it gets into tourism because that's the only way to get any money coming in. They can't do production, so they'll become tourist destinations. And then they can market their history and everything and spin it so it becomes like, come see Rome, go see Athens, go check out, Barcelona, whatever. And they do that instead of production. So rather than making stuff, they're marketing their landscape and marketing their cultural past too. The problem with that is tourism takes an enormous amount of money. And because these are largely socialized economies, in the sense that when the EU forms, one of the promises for the various countries is that healthcare will be largely subsidized by government, education will be largely free, subsidized by government. So a lot of stuff becomes government subsidized versus, say, private sector like it is in the United States. And so in that context, there's an enormous amount of money going out to pay for these services. And in the southern part of the EU, they don't have their production base. In other words, they aren't generating the amount of revenue to cover that. So what they do is they go to the northern countries, especially Germany, and they go to the German banks, especially Deutsche Bank, and they go to them and basically say, hey, we need a loan. And because one, it's the EU, and two, because it's a unified organization, the banks in the northern part of Europe think, hey, well, if we give the Spanish a loan, they have to pay it back because they're part of the EU. They don't have any choice. They can't renege on it at some time in the future, which countries used to do a lot. So basically, and that works well. So then what happens is the banks in the northern part actually start soliciting the southern part for loans. So it's just like, in your mailbox, something like that, you might get a, invitation for a new Capital One credit card, and guaranteed you'll have, this amount in the account, just sign and get a card. Basically, at a giant way, that's what happens is the banks in the north start soliciting and actually encouraging loans from the countries in the south, given the fact that they think it's a guaranteed, payback thing. And the countries in the south want money to spend because it makes them look good politically, keeps them in operation, whatever political party's in charge. Population's happy because, they got free healthcare, free education and stuff like that. So no one's asking the really rude question, can you pay the loan? Can you make the monthly payments if you don't think of it that way? And so what happens is everyone's sort of skating along and they're sort of surviving okay until 06, 09, when basically you end up with a huge economic collapse, which just absolutely hammers Europe. Now, in the period prior to this, in the say 15, 20 years prior to this, what you also get is not only these money moving back and forth, money going south, promissory notes going north, But you also get large populations from the northern regions, especially UK, Germany, and stuff like that, moving vacation homes in Italy or Spain, or either moving there for retirement. So again, because it's free movement, there's a lot of people moving around to, especially moving from the cold areas in the north to the warm areas in the south. Think of folks in New York moving to Florida to retire. Same thing. Now that all works fine. And again, the countries in the South are totally stoked with that. They've got these people moving down here. They've got, good fixed incomes, the property values go up. So, everyone's a happy camper until all of a sudden, bang, when 06, 09 hits, and all of a sudden these folks leave, the property values collapse. There's no money available. Tourism takes a huge hit. And basically all of a sudden the countries in the southern part of Europe have no money coming in at all. They not only can't pay their bills, they also can't pay their loans back. And they can't keep their social services up they promised the people. And so what happens is they go back and they basically tell the banks, we can't make payments. And the banks basically say, well, you don't have a choice. You signed a piece of paper, you owe us. And someone like Spain's going, what are you going to do? Collateral, you got to take the city of Barcelona from us. What are you going to do? Basically sort of daring them. And the banks come back and basically say, well, if you want to remain part of the EU, you got to pay your bills. So then what happens is the pressure happens for the southern countries, the ones that are, literally have gone bankrupt within 1 inch of it, to basically get rid of their social services, start making people pay for medical care, start making people pay for their pensions, start making people pay for their elderly care, for education. And, that's their attitude, legitimately. It's sort of like, well, one, that wasn't part of the deal. Two, we can't do that because we don't have any jobs, and maybe 20% of the population is unemployed. How the hell are they supposed to pay for healthcare? And the banks are going, oh, we don't care. You got to make payments. And so what happens is the EU, which never really very organized anyways, starts to fragment with the enormous economic pressure of the fact that all the money is in the north. All the folks taking out loans are in the south. And by 09, there's a huge amount of friction going back and forth. Italy, Greece is still within 2 inches of being bankrupt. Italy actually went bankrupt for about 8 hours one day, where they were basically just sort of, go like chapter 11 if a country can do it. And basically just sort of push the countries in the north to subsidize it. But if I'm the German prime minister, whoever's replacing Merkel, then I've got to go tell my German taxpayers that, well, part of your money that you're paying to the German budget, in terms of taxes, is going to go to pay for Italian salaries. And, the Germans are legitimately going to be all bent out of shape because it's like, well, if the Italians had their shit together and actually had a better job of managing their finances, they wouldn't be sitting here hitting us up for money all the time. So just tell them to grow up and just pay their bills. So what happens is the warm and fuzzies really start to sort of just unravel really, really quickly with the 06-09 crisis. And at that point, the EU looks a lot more fragile and a lot less coherent. Now, you also have then these Eastern countries join in, Romania, Slovakia, et cetera, either join in as full or partial members of the EU. And while that seemed a good idea prior to 06, because there were factories are going in, there was money all over the place, there was a shortage of people working, and since you had more jobs, you did bodies. Then all of a sudden, after 06-09, it's just the opposite. Now you got a ton of bodies, no jobs, factories are closing all over the place, money's really tight. And so basically all of a sudden everyone's really less entranced with this whole idea of a larger EU, but you can't undo it. Once you've invited someone into the party, they're part of the, they're part of the team. They just still say, well, it seemed like a good idea last week, but we don't need you anymore. So you end up with this, everything was done very opportunistically and with very little foresight into possible change. Everyone just sort of assumed the good times were going to continue. And like the United States does the same thing all the time. It's just a really dumb idea because the good times are never always really going to continue. The good times are always a temporary phenomenon. Now, what happens on top of all this then? So you've got all this crisis going on. So it's now 08, 09, that a lot of messes going on. You also have the fact that on one hand, you have large numbers, millions of folks from other countries, in some cases, these new Eastern members of the EU, in other cases, other countries, most famously the Turks in Germany, who are basically invited, temporary workforce, but they've been in that country for ages. There's a lot of Turks in Germany who are third generation Turkish, ethnically, who have been born in Germany. So their parents were born in Germany, maybe their grandparents emigrated back in 1960 or something. They can't become German citizens. In many of the European countries, but especially in Germany, you can only be a German citizen if you have German blood. So it's very much that title of that video, Blood and Belonging, is how the Germans see it. That's actually in their legal system. sociobiology defines German ethnicity. So you have the weird situation that someone who from the United States, I'm not, but we'll say that, in our case, I think we have some relative, probably like 10 generations ago, as German. As long as I can prove that link to that person, I can move to Germany and become a citizen because I have German blood. So it's sort of like, getting Hawaiian Homes property or even getting to CAM school. As long as you can prove you're part Hawaiian, you've got access, potentially. Germany's the same way. So the weird situation is someone who was born in Germany, who only speaks German, but their only heritage in terms of their grandparents is from Turkey, can't be a citizen. Someone who's living in, Cincinnati, Ohio, whose great grandparents, one of them was German, can be a German citizen. It's nuts when you think about it. And that's one of the problems is you had all these diverse different attitudes of who's us and who isn't us. At the same time, you had this large migrant workforce coming in that was taking all the low-end jobs that were basically making these, production economies so profitable. German companies like Volkswagen makes obscene amounts of money because of the cheap labor force they've got. But those aren't Germans. Germans are some of the labor force, but they're generally management. Most of the labor force are other ethnic groups. And that means, of course, you can pay them less. They don't have access to civil service jobs. They don't have access to the same resources a German citizen does. So that's how Europe became successful. It was, sort of a two-dimensional sham, to be honest. And then 06, 09 just sort of blew that open because you not only had this change economically, but now what are you going to do with these millions of workers you've got who, basically they own property or they try to own property, they've set up shop, their kids are in your schools, but they're not you. And so there's enormous pressure in many cases to just sort of tell these folks, like the Turks, it's been nice having you guys, but would you please go home? Till the realization shows up that if you get rid of them, you basically don't have your lowest tier of the production base. You don't have the people that clean the hotel rooms. You don't have all the people that are doing all the mundane menial jobs that Germans don't want to do. That's being done by these migrant folks. And so if you get rid of them, then who's going to do the work? So you end up in this sort of catch-22 that you got this cheap population, but they now become indispensable, but you don't like them because they're not you. Now by 06, 07, 08, at the same time this is happening, you start to end up with massive increases in the conflicts, especially in West Asia, usually called the Middle East, places like Syria, Lebanon, such like that. Also Georgia, Moldova, Ukraine. So what you get is countries fringing the EU more and more start to have large numbers of what we call refugees. If you go back to the earlier discussion we had. And so in many cases, because of what happened in World War II, et cetera, Europe sort of consigned itself to having to let in a large number of refugees as sort of payment for their sins of the past century, especially Germany. So you end up with not only the folks that are coming into work, I say for folks from Turkey, but you also end up with refugees from Georgia, from Lebanon, from wherever that are coming in that you have to allow in because of your constitutional obligation. And so what happens is then when they get into Germany, the refugees don't have to stay there because it's free movement throughout the EU. So all of a sudden they might end up in Denmark or Norway or somewhere else in the EU just because it's more attractive. They don't like the Germans or whatever. And so the rest of the EU has to suddenly deal with large amounts of refugees, though their internal policies within their own country might be we don't want refugees. That was certainly true in the UK. They were okay with folks who had been part of the old UK system, folks from the British Caribbean region, like say Jamaica or something like that. And that they already had huge numbers of migrants in the UK. But there was a difference in their view between migrants that were coming to the UK who had some tie to their past history and a group of refugees from Syria, for example, that had nothing to do with anything tied to the UK. And especially as this religious terrorism started to be on the increase in Europe, or more accurately, religious terrorism started to be highly visible in Europe. Most famously, the bomb attacks on the rail at the train station in Madrid in Spain. What you had is that tended to make the idea of refugees even less attractive. So in that context, what happened is more and more countries started to look at internally in terms of, if we're Austria, what do we want? If we're the Netherlands, what do we want? And the idea of the EU became less and less attractive because all of a sudden the problems of being part of this collective were starting to outweigh the advantages, because the advantages had almost entirely been just sort of convenience and economics. But now it was starting to be a threat on their sense of ethnic national identity. And all of a sudden people are going, I'm not sure this is a good idea. The UK is the one that finally ends this. The UK starts this really strange process called the Brexit. Feel free. I think the Wikipedia article is actually pretty good on that, as I remember, that actually talks about how the hell that came about, which is really strange. But the end result is about 5 years ago, the British population, by virtue of a plebiscite, just barely decides we're out of here, we're out of the EU. And their main logic for that was the fact that they saw that uncontrolled access to refugees and other stuff was degrading British national identity. So basically, the UK, which of course they saw as being British, was not going to be allowed to be British if they remained in the EU. That being British was more important than being part of the EU. So basically, the ideas of the 50s and 60s now weren't worth it. Now, of course, one of the side effects of this is as the EU pulls out, or I should say, as the UK pulls out of the EU, what you get is the other minority groups in the UK, the Scots in the north, the Welsh in the southwest, the Irish in Northern Ireland, are all sort of like, well, hold it, Newt. What about us? Just as a note, there's enormous oil reserves off here, which are a huge part of the wealth of the UK comes from oil here in the North Sea that they then pump out and sell to everyone, sort of like a miniature version of Saudi Arabia. And Norway, the same thing. They both using this field system. But the thing is Scotland's actually the part of the UK that's nearest to the oil. Scotland's where all the pollution ends up. Scotland's where all the work is done. Scotland's where all the workers are. And yet all the money gets spent down here in the south with the Brits. And so Scotland has formally said when the Brexit's finished, which is supposed to be this year, that Scotland's going to have another plebiscite. And under the way the UK is set up, Scotland will very likely secede from the UK and be its own country again, which it was in like the 1500s. So all of a sudden, this chunk from here north would be a new country called Scotland. And the reason they think they can get away with it is because, one, it's in the constitution they have with the Brits. Secondly, is they're the ones that have access to the oil. The Brits, of course, are hugely upset because they spend all the money from the oil. And they sure as hell don't want it to disappear, because all of a sudden then the Brexit's a lot less attractive idea. The Welsh want out. The Welsh are going to have their plebiscite. They're waiting for the Scots. If the Scots leave, the Welsh are going to leave with them. I don't know that Wales really has anything that makes any money. They just don't like the Brits. Scots and the Welsh don't like the British at all, and never have. And the British have always taken huge advantage of them in the last 500 years. So there's a lot of bad blood there. So you're very likely they're going to have, it's going to be a non-United Kingdom. There's going to be 3 countries. Northern Ireland has to stay with the Brits because the politics of not being part of Ireland. So what you're having is one, the UK leaves the EU. Secondly, is the UK then very likely unravels. Other countries in the EU then start to look at this and think, well, if it wasn't useful for the Brits, if it were Spain, for example, is it worth it for us? If you're France, because the financial center is Germany, not France, but France sees itself as the other big player, which it is. If they don't feel like they're getting a fair shake, and this is the current French government is actually talking about this, about leaving the EU because they're not getting enough leverage. So the EU is starting to basically sort of unravel, just like a piece of cheap cloth or cheap rope or something like that. And this is an enormously complex situation. Now, of course, if we move this into 2022, you not only have with a massive increase in the issue of refugees, but in 2022, you've got enormous numbers of Russian troops massing on the border of the Ukraine. The Ukraine is not part of the EU, but they're considered friends of the EU. And some of the countries, especially up here, that used to be part of the USSR, and some of the countries down here that also used to be part of the USSR, especially Poland, are very, very aggressively trying to sort of pull the EU into this whole thing. Now, the EU is an economic system, but it also is sort of a shared self-defense, group support system. And this is one of the really scary side effects of the Russian aggression here on the eastern border of the Ukraine, is if they actually push the button and try to invade and take over the Ukraine, no one's really too sure what the EU is going to do. The Russians are obviously gambling the EU, which can't even agree on what they're doing next week, is not going to actually collectively do anything. If they do, you basically start World War III. So there's a huge number of people that are making enormous gambles based on what they think is going to happen. The Brits just a couple of days ago gave a bunch of weapons to the Ukraine. Now that they're not part of the EU, they don't give a rat's ass what the EU wants to do. So it's, the tensions in eastern part of Europe tied to the EU are just, literally by every day are just ratcheting up. And the pressures have never, nothing's ever been resolved. The problems are getting larger. The solutions are becoming less and less visible through there at all. So the EU and Europe in general are in a really enormous state of flux right now. As someone who's traveled to Europe, if you have been there, it's actually incredibly convenient to be able to take a train in France, for example, from Paris and end up in Italy or someplace else. And you just get on the train, there's no visas, there's no nothing. You just go and you just go places, and it all uses the euro. So there's enormous amounts of convenience and advantages to the EU. But the problem is it's all just run into a huge sort of rock. And the rock is the fact that national ethnic identity was never actually discussed when the EU was formed. They've always managed to avoid having that discussion because they don't have any agreement on how they should handle it. And with the enormous influx of workers and refugees and such like that, you can see this whether it's the Burqa law in France or whatever. The whole issue of being the European Union really is being much more problematic, except for the Germans who have made huge advantages out of it. So they're the great, sort of supporters for the continuation of the EU. But more and more, they're finding less people in the audience that are thinking, yeah, okay, we think it's a good idea too. So, this is one of those situations by the time the semester ends in May, I think this whole presentation would be radically different. In fact, I think this presentation might be radically different if we do it on February 20th. So we'll see.